So briefly, I grew up in a fairly difficult home. The expectation at my local school that I went to was that you exited at 14 years and 10 months or when you became pregnant.
Yeah.
Well, that was the day. This was the 60s and 70s. And I was born in the 50s. And so I left home suddenly at 14 years and 9 or 10, 11 months, a 15-year-old. And I had very few role models in my life before I ran away from home. But I was very fortunate in that I knew then explicitly that life is better than this at other places. And
where did that come from, though? Where did that sense of optimism or?
I don't know. I know that there were people in our neighbourhood that sort of looked out for our family. My father was very violent, and so we would often flee to different neighbours' houses, but inevitably if he ever showed up on their doorsteps, we would be ushered out, because it's private business, family business, So, but when I left home, I met a nursing nun who was an outreach nun for kids on the streets, and I was technically one of those. I was homeless and couch surfing and all the rest of it. And she told me that she felt I could do something more, because what she witnessed of me doing, and I didn't realise I was doing it, was that I was always helping others. If someone needed something from the shop, I'd be happy to run up the shop and get them something. Or if someone needed a hand lifting something, I was always there to do it.
For family or for the neighbours?
No, when I was living on the street.
Yeah, okay.
So if someone fell or needed help or someone to talk to, and I used to love listening to the old men that were returned servicemen from World War One.
Where did you meet? Where did you see them? Where did you meet with them?
Just around King's Cross, Darlinghurst, in the inner city area. It was just where everyone stayed and lived, and I lived at that time in a hostel. Anyhow, that's a long story. But what I did was I met this inspiration. That was this nursing nun, and she said, you can do more than this.
Yeah.
You can't stay like this, And I took her advice and I enrolled in technical college, and I did a nurse's entrance course, and I was then able to enrol in nursing in a hospital-based nursing program where over 3 years you would then become a nursing sister, just like my hero. And interestingly, I was able to live in at the hospital, and you had your own room with a lock on the door, right? First time ever, right? Yeah. You got beautiful uniforms, like they were just so fancy, these uniforms, and you'd wear stockings or pantyhose and have these white Halls shoes, and it was very, it was wonderful. And so I became a nurse, and I lived in the nurses' home for quite a bit of my course, and absolutely loved every second of it. And so, that was my first inspiration. And I met many others from that time. And quite frankly, even though nursing is such a small part of my career, I went on to medical school and do other things. Yeah. I still rely really on the principles that I learnt in nursing, which was always about helping others and knowing how to move people, knowing when to shut up and listen, knowing when to just hold a hand when someone's dying. I learned all these things, and today I use all of that stuff. Compassion, putting myself in their shoes, understanding that, the sick person today is the well person yesterday, the well person tomorrow. There's a way of threading that through, recognising holistic health, and, when someone's emotionally unwell, they're also likely to be physically unwell.
Yeah.
All of that stuff you learn in nursing. And so, that's been a really important lesson in life for me. It's hard not to bring, one's whole self. I don't really know what that means, to be honest. I'm just using that term because it seems to be quite de rigueur at the moment. But bringing one's whole self to it. It's very hard to compartmentalise, parts of your life that are really super important to you in a professional workplace such as this. And we all have, you're right, we all have different identities, and we can be a carer or a mum, or when we need to be, and then we can be this absolutely hardcore decision maker at work when going gets tough and you have to make some decisions. But for me, I think spirituality is one of those things that you practice, that you do. It's an active thing. It's not something which is, I have this belief structure and I'll just connect with it when at certain times, or for me, I think spirituality is the act of doing your day-to-day things. It's how you're mindful of writing an email to someone that may contain material that they may not necessarily want to have, or a workload issue. Being mindful of what that burden is for another person when you're asking them to do something, and that for me is part of my spiritual practice, I guess, that I do my best to be as mindful as I can, and I know when I'm not, I feel quite jolted and discombobulated and just...
You feel it physically.
Yeah, I feel it physically when I'm not. But, that being said, I'm a very, I have faith. I'm a woman of faith. I may not look like a woman of faith, but I am a very strong woman of faith. And I've never had any kind of difficulties in reconciling my grandmother's culture in with my, European faith, my Judeo-Christian faith. It's not something I've ever been conflicted about. Many years ago, I practice yoga, I contemplate, I meditate, I do a whole swathe of things, and that's never been anything more than a human being looking after themselves in a way that makes sense to them.
Yeah.
I've always been in service.
Yeah.
Right, so that's the logic of my career. Okay, I've been in service of others, and I wouldn't have been able to articulate that until the last few years. So when I started nursing, it was about being in service. When I was nursing, I met some people who were in the military as reservists, and I went to the recruiting depot, and they didn't really need pupil nurses at that time, and it was interesting because I thought, okay, fine, you don't want me, sniff. And I spoke, it was years later that I ended up going back to a recruiting office and saying I would like to join the military, and reaching out to friends of mine who were in the military, and learnt that there was a specialist reserve in the Royal Australian Air Force, and they've never had a public health person, they've never had an epidemiologist, they didn't know what to do with me, so they recruited me into an allied health specialisation, which makes sense, public health, and I've been in ever since. But again, it's about serving one's country.
But you could have served serving your country, is that what, yeah. And did it have ties back to your family and serving in, that was important in your family, the service to country and fighting overseas wars?
Yeah, so that's interesting because, my father, the brutalisation he endured during his years in World War II, he brought that war home. Right, he was shell-shocked in those days. We call it PTSD nowadays. But he was never managed. He had a very high level of recognised disability through DVA, and so his repatriation benefits were quite high because he was very much unsound in every sense of the word. So I was always very proud that my father did serve. I saw some of his letters that he wrote home as a young man, and he wrote to his younger sister, and he included one silk stocking. See, when you serve with the Americans, you get all these really groovy gifts like tobacco and stockings.
Lots of
Hershey's
chocolates. Probably.
Yeah, they were really rich. And so he had this one stocking, and he put it in the envelope for her, and he said, I've got a pair of silk stockings for you, and I'll give you the other silk stocking when you finish school. It was just something like that, So there was this one stocking and this other stocking, and when he came home, he gave her both stockings. So
a commitment.
It was a real commitment, and and he did the same thing with the fountain pen. he sent the fountain pen and promised her the ink when he returned,
Yeah.
because they were all really poor. So yeah, my father went off to serve the nation in World War II, in and out of service for decades, a decade or so, and he, despite being damaged, kept going back in, because that was his community, that was his family, and he supported all of his sisters. He was the only guy in the family and the breadwinner, and so he supported this whole household. My mother's father, at the same time, was in the US Small Ships program that was running out of Australia up to PNG, and he was a former naval, he was a seaman of some sort. We don't know much about his story, we just know he jumped boat. And my grandfather ended up skippering a pearl lugger called the Hilda Norling all the way up the coast into Papua New Guinea, and they were in part to resupply the Allied lines and to get comms there, and it was all quite mountainous, and of course they didn't have any military cover, no military protection, they certainly didn't have air cover. The Japanese raiding party came in, the planes came, bombed this fleet. There were thousands of boats, that did this journey all the way up, and his little crew and the small flotilla with them went up this one particular estuary. They got bombed. A lot of lives lost, including my grandfather. My father, at the same time, is flying missions over New Guinea. So, I don't know whether he flew over the debris or whether he was one of the people that, took the remains or whatever. Fascinating story.
It's a fascinating story.
But yeah, so I come from a long line of service people. I had a great uncle that died in Gallipoli. I had other family members serve. I've got a cousin that's a Vietnam vet and, became a major and lieutenant colonel. Just lovely. So
there was a tradition you wanted to follow, a calling for you, or just how you saw your how you could best serve was through.
I guess I had the language of that. It wasn't anything weird to join the military in my family. It wasn't odd. What was odd in my family was going to university, and I was the first in my family to go to university. People sort of said, "What do you mean you go to where? Just go to TAFE." Go to tech college, we didn't go to university, there were certainly no conversations at the dining room table about university.
So that's where I'm trying to, how did that, how did you take, because that takes a lot of courage to move into a world that there was no tradition in your family, no language for it. How did you, where did that courage come from? Where did you, was it just a drive or a...
No, I tripped over into it, to be honest.
Yeah.
So I was nursing at Lidcombe Hospital. That's where I did my training. And at the time, in my last couple of years, they built a number of facilities on that campus. When I got there was a brand new building called the New Block, and that was going to become the start of what was to become Westmead Hospital further west, right? So that was the first start of it. It was just on the outskirts of the Rookwood Cemetery, right? It was a big, huge space of land there. It was an established Schedule 5 hospital. They built a thing called Ferguson Lodge there, which was a home for paraplegic and quadriplegic patients. There were long neuro wards, and they built Cumberland College behind the fence of Ward 43 with this beautiful library. And it was a college, a tertiary education institution that eventually became part of the University of Sydney. And they had this library, and they allowed the pupil nurses at the Lidcombe Hospital to crawl through the fence and walk across a paddock. I kid you not, it was a paddock in the day.
Cows too, I'm sure.
The fancy pants library of college, and utilise their resources.
Yeah.
And man, they had some really cool stuff. And so that I got talking to people there, and at that time they decided to transition nursing from being a hospital-based program to a university-based program. So I got to meet university people, and they said, well, if you want a career in nursing and become a pupil nurse educator, which is one of the things I wanted to do, they said you have to do a university degree. And I said, don't be ridiculous, people like me don't go to university, or words to that effect. And so I left nursing, did some work, screen printer, did some graphic artwork, just mucked around, still did nursing, night shifts, and kept my hand in the discipline, mainly in old people's homes, because I really like working with old people, because I like their stories. And then someone said, I went to Sydney and used to share all these stories about life at Sydney University, and I met a lot of his mates. We were in a relationship for a bit. And then I wrote to the University of Sydney and said I'd like to study medicine to become a brain surgeon or something ridiculous. And they wrote back and said, well, we're prepared to interview you, because they recognised my nursing qualification as something that could be enough to assist me in withstanding the rigours of what was then a 6-year degree in medicine. And so I went in for the interview, and in 1992 I started first year medicine at this university, along with a bunch of other mature age students, and I was mature by that stage, I was certainly over 30, who were nurses or osteopaths. We had a chiropractor there, we had a couple of physiotherapists, we had a dentist, they were experimenting with people from different disciplines. And it was in advance of that medicine program changing from an undergraduate degree to a postgraduate degree. That happened about 4 or 5 years later after I started, but that's why. So it's sort of like timing, it was just lucky, because if I'd done that earlier on, they would have said, you're kidding, go away. But they didn't. And so, that's how I got in. And, I decided to stay in academia, I moved out of medicine. I did my preclinical years, they were really hard years. I had to repeat and, just do it again and again and again. It was really tough. But then I went into public health, and I really felt I found my calling. I started doing a PhD. I got a really good job at South Eastern Area Health Service as the epidemiologist for the area. I was the acting officer there when my boss went away. I was the head of the public health unit. And then I came back into academia and got a job as a senior lecturer at UNSW. So I'm explaining this to my mum. Mum, I'm going to work at a university teaching. I'm going to be teaching people about public health. Oh, that's lovely. Then I get a promotion to an associate professor. My mother was distressed. So you've gone downhill from senior lecturer to associate professor. No, actually, that's a step up, Mum. Okay, all right, got it, right? Then some years later, I get a promotion to professor. I say to my mum, I've got a promotion, I'm now called professor. She said, oh, so... No. I think Mum thought a university education was pretty useless. Like, why would you become someone who could call yourself doctor and not be able to write a script? So I think, because there's no reference structure of university or, anyone in the professions in my family before me, people don't understand not only just the huge amount of work that's involved in, getting from starting a degree to the funny hat parade at the end of it, but there also was this realisation that you've moved away from them. Like, you've become a different person to us. And that is true. Education does change you. And it can change some for the good and for the better, and some to different people that their families don't recognise anymore. And this is always a bit of a fear. And one of the things that I think we've been doing over the last couple of decades in the academy is that we've been kicking open the doors for people who are traditionally underserved, so that the academy can see and work with people who are going home to communities or to where they grew up to apply their skills as teachers and nurses and doctors and lawyers and social workers and economists and scientists and artists in their hometowns, suburbs, cities, in their own families and communities. And I think a lot of the changes in how government treats education, making kids stay at school until there is one of those triggers for leaving, that is, you've finished your HSC or you've gotten a trade or a place at TAFE, or these are the triggers for leaving school on the whole, and you can go. So that by its own account has made education something of a very different aspiration for many families where that wasn't. So we have a lot of people in uni nowadays who are first in family or second in family or third in family, like their siblings went to uni, but certainly not their parents. The other thing that's happened is a lot of workplace training has changed. So nowadays, you have to go to TAFE to become a sparky or an electrician. You cannot just be an apprentice to someone who's really good at what they do and then at the end of it signs a certificate that goes somewhere, you get a stamp on it after you pay your $10 and you're an electrician, yay. So there's a very different expectation of competency. Makes a lot of sense, the system's changed. So education is in a different kind of reach nowadays. And, a lot of that started, back in the 70s with Gough Whitlam and the opening up of education to all, so that it wasn't only a fee-based structure where only the very wealthy can afford to send their kids, or only those who were bright enough or in a school that valued getting kids ready for application to scholarships.
Yeah.
So, the system's changed. Everyone knows what a university is now.
Yeah.
We still don't have as many people aspiring to come to university as we'd like, but, the narrative is changing slowly over time. It's scholarship programs, setting up scholarship programs. And why I say that is that when I was at uni, here, at this uni as a student, it was so tough because you had to pay the rent, had to study, had no idea what studying full-time was really all about. Had to look after myself. Then I had some other obligations within family to deal with as well. I was failing and I felt, not as much support out there as I should have. We had the Koori Centre here, the student support was great, but they could only go so far. No one could pay my rent for me. There were no scholarships available for me. I wasn't able to get the help to have to not to have to work so many hours to keep the food on the table.
Yep.
And I lived on rice for a very, very, very long time. Rice and soy with a cucumber chopped on top, etc. That was dinner, lunch and breakfast. So I lived with, I felt a degree of indignity during my medical degree. It was a very undignified degree, frankly, because of my personal circumstances. I wasn't alone, others were in similar circumstances, so it was a little cohort of us. But when I got to UNSW and I saw the opportunity of another student who was just like me, struggling to make ends meet, wanting to be a doctor, but, just really challenging every part of her body to keep on working and studying and staying in. I went to a group of people, I did a talk one night and someone whipped out a checkbook, wrote out a cheque for the first year scholarship for that person to be able to live in one of the on-campus colleges. That was a big deal because then we were able to grow more scholarships, and that college today is responsible for 15% of all the Aboriginal medical doctors in Australia.
So that's the systemic change
was
that
you're really big deal for me. And here at Sydney, I've just taken that same approach, and we've now got over 70 Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander students living on campus or in university-owned accommodation, studying every degree under the sun.
Yeah.
Right. Many, many different degrees. That's what I look back on in my career, is that's the thing that I affected the change because of my own direct experience. I wanted to make sure that people had a bit more dignity. There are people that are looked up to as leaders that I just take a step back from and just I worry. I'm worried for the future.
Are you?
I am very worried for the future because I'm not seeing our leaders being able to not being respected. I'm seeing people.
In which sector of or sphere of life? In all spheres?
Let's look at Australia.
Yeah.
One of the most confounding issues of our time. There's a few really confounding issues, but one that's been persistent for almost 250 years is how Australia has never reconciled with its First Peoples. When the Europeans arrived and took possession of this land on behalf of a distant crown, there was no treaty. There was no respect shown. There was no opportunity to be able to sit down and learn the language of this place, the customs of this place, the cultures of this place. There was then a very brutal means of dislocating people from their countries or their land, their homes, their ancestral homes, of murders and massacres in the name of greed or of Jesus. There was never a reckoning of those times, and it took every ounce of so much energy to get people to understand that Aboriginal people should be counted in the census and enumerated properly. Aboriginal people should be able to vote in Australia, and that was in the 60s that happened. By the time we got to the 90s, High Court challenges were all over the shop, to recognise that Aboriginal people were here. There was a history wars that was going on where it wasn't even recognised that Aboriginal people were here first, and that instead Aboriginal people were some sort of missing link to current day humanity. And so people had to drag others through court for the Commonwealth then to say, aha, Aboriginal people are in fact the first peoples of Australia. Okay, well that's great, people have known that for a long time. But then you've still got all of this stuff that's going on, and the wonderful, marvellous opportunity for reconciliation was completely slapped in the face in the 2010s to 2020s. And now the opportunity of the most modest inclusion in the constitution of this land that was fundamentally written by a bunch of white guys as in men, the women weren't there, 1901 Australian Constitution, written by these fellas, blokes, which, if you look at the demographic of them now, is very small. No one of colour, no one of Asian descent, Middle Eastern descent, who's European descent, and only particular parts of Europe only, and men. The modest request to recognise Aboriginal people in the constitution of this land and to have an opportunity to contribute to debates and discussions on matters that affect them was denied by 60% of the Australian population. And we know that today's Australia, nearly half of all Australians are either first or second generation Australians. So those people who recently came here were told it's okay to be ignorant. If you don't know, don't worry about it, just vote no. Don't get yourself understanding of this land that protects you, that looks after you, that feeds you, that hosts you and your family. So leadership today is not something that I can see clearly right now. I can see a lot of very passionate, decent people who are very localised leaders, but I'm not really seeing coming out of what's happening now any real leaders of any substance. The world is in a shaky place. So we've got this Aboriginal, the denial of our right to be recognised on our own land. It's a shame job in Australia. Shame job. But then you've got that secondary thing of all of these gaps, in education, in health, in land ownership or home ownership, in self-agency. We've got more kids than ever now living in out-of-home care. The prisons are, more than double-digit figures, or they are double-digit figures of Aboriginal incarceration, yet we remain as way less than 5% of the Australian population in a nation that is amongst one of the wealthiest in the world. Per capita wealth is right up there, and yet we still can't fix what's going on with education in Aboriginal Australia or health in Aboriginal Australia. And in fact, Australia is so deeply rejecting of Aboriginal people that it doesn't really want to know about them. So it's that whole vote of ignorance has won the power, and we're seeing the ignorance vastly around the world right this second. You can see ignorance everywhere. There are even people who deny sea level rise has anything to do with human effects on climate and warming. And it's no longer global warming, it's now global heating. It's not warm, it's
boiling.
Hot. And it's soon going to be global boiling. And that's a real thing.
Yep.
We're losing species by the second, we're losing languages by the second, we're losing cultures by the second, we're gaining weight by the second. We're not healthy. We're not strong, we're not fit, we're not active, we're not compassionate, we're not able to search out truth, we're not able to make our own decisions. I don't see leadership. I see localised leadership. I see sparks of light. I see hope abound. I'm not sure what we need for the future to wake us out of the stupor that we've fallen into, because these matters are critical. We had a real chance in Australia to say yes in a referendum. When we chose not to, we picked ignorance instead. Okay, we'll move on. We are a resilient people. We will continue doing what we're doing anyhow, of making good in the university sector, making good in the health sector, doing our very best. But there's other issues which are much, much bigger as well, such as how are we going to feed the earth? How are we going to clear the airs? How are we going to make sure we've got nice clean water for people to drink when we're issuing fracking licences all over the place so that people can contaminate the artesian basin, our last source water supply in this driest continent of Earth? You know, we've got really big issues, and we're not willing to deal with one that's been going for a couple of 100 years. We're certainly not going to be dealing with the other ones. Well, we're not going to be good ancestors.
No.
People will look upon our generations and those of us alive today, even the young ones, and say, how many iPhones did you have? Did you wait until it was completely dead before you bought a new one? Yes or no? You know, how many garments did you buy? You know, like, do you really need 14 T-shirts?
So
do you know what I mean?
I do. I agree.
There's no, we aren't allowing ourselves agents to be our own leaders. We can't even lead ourselves. We're in a really poor state. And I can imagine the people for who our ancestors would be looking at us going, wow, do you really need to eat that much food? You know, we were able to have one meal a day, and we had chicken on Sundays because that was special. You know, do you really need a wardrobe that's when we used to deal with both of us in a wardrobe this big? You know what I mean? Like, how are we setting up the future? And yeah, I'm not entirely confident. We need people to show their own self-agency and their own strength and their own commitment to their own ideals that are good for others. You know, we've got so many people that are asking, what's in it for me? Oh, I don't want to do that because, you know, I can't be bothered. You know, I don't want to give money to, you know, Cruise for Chrissy Day lunches, or I don't want to give money to, you know, this organisation to assist people who are being shelled out of their homes. And let's not talk about Ukraine. And let's not talk about what happened, what Hamas did. You know, certainly let's not talk about the starving millions that are going through an extreme famine in parts of Africa. Let's not talk about flood and mudslide victims in other parts of Asia. Let's not talk about the human suffering of human slavery in countless factories around the world that are making beautiful clothes. Or the children that are weaving baskets that are only just 4 years old. You know, like, where is our thoughtfulness? No. We've got politicians that invite you to remain ignorant. So I think the real leadership now has to come from within, where people can say, well, I've had enough of that. I'm going to find out about it. I'm going to make my own decision. I'm going to learn how to really find sources of information that is true. I'm going to go to the independent media and learn about this stuff. I'm going to find ways of making my own decisions. I choose not to remain ignorant. Now, I see that as being leadership.
Yeah.
If people can start doing that and guiding their families and taking some time to reflect and sitting down and turning off the telly and getting people to have some rest from the telephone and the Facebook and the social media, and just have some time to go out for a walk and reflect on what you can do to de-weed this little patch of roadside. You know what I used to do when I was really miserable? And I still do this, not when I'm miserable, I just do it now, is I get a dirty big glove on, you know, I just get an old bag and I go through the street, around my street, and I pick up rubbish And then I've got another bag, get the leaves for the compost bin, And I just clean my little block. It's a small block. It's only about 40 houses, Some of my neighbours think it's a joke. Oh, you've got to be careful of syringes.
They'd miss you if you didn't do it though, Lisa, because they're
But, it's like, it allows me to be mindful. It allows me to pay attention to the environment. It allows me to see the street. It allows me to recognise where the drain holes are that are plugged up. It allows me to see where the little rescued bat was. I live in just around the corner from here in inner city west. And, it's being able to just do one little thing. That's agency, that's leadership. Being able to give a hand to someone. Everyone talks about, not having Christmas lunch with their family, but rather going off and helping poor people by cooking. That's really great, but there's 364 other days of the year you can do that, So you can do that. You've got agency to do that, or to give and be really mindful about your giving. Go give blood. That's leadership. That's you're expressing your agency. And by saying to others, this is what I do, I've given 120 donations of blood, people go, whoa, that's a lot. I've given none. Let me help you. That's leadership. And I think we need to have a little bit more of it nowadays rather than relying on others. People aren't expressing their leadership. But yeah, we did in COVID because I think that was driven from fear. No one knew what to do. And then, of course, all the anti-vax conspiracy theorists came out, and some people latched onto that like crazy, and it's still latched on very strongly to that sort of world view. And that is people's individual rights to do that so they wish. But what worries me is that then sometimes that can also feed into a pathology. It could lead into a furthering an anxiety that then ends up becoming clinical. And this is the danger of how this can progress, and the danger of people looking at one side of something, or looking at only a narrative that fits their narrow worldview, and that can be really hard. Very hard to do, especially if there's someone you love who has an opinion different to you. Often you see people just shutting that out rather than listening.
It's too hard.
It's really difficult, isn't it? Yeah. So we've got a lot of that sort of stuff happening in the world at the moment, and that's one of the things that worries me as well, is that people may have done their own research on this one particular site that basically talks about child slavery and
it's an echo chamber.
Pizza parlour in America or something. But it's an echo chamber, and it becomes quite tricky. So, coming back to the role of leadership, and I know I've talked around it, is that, I don't really see any real strength in leadership, whether you're talking about the world governance mechanisms of the UN. I see a lot of action, but I'm not really seeing anything coming of that. There's a lot of toothlessness. We've now become very game to defy authority as a world. And I think COVID also taught people how to, step outside of their house when there was a full-on shutdown, and, despite what people like me thought that was the wrong thing to do, they still did it. And so people have learned to defy authorities because often people don't want to act to constrain them. People are now saying things that would have been unsaid 5 years ago. I've seen people acting up on aircraft lately that it's just really surprising. You would never have seen that before COVID. You're seeing people abuse bus drivers. I mean, every time you get on a plane now, it's like, please treat each other with respect, please treat the crew with respect. And it's like, we've never had to be told to treat people with respect. But you've got to call it for what it is. You can't paint over the time.
No.
These are tricky times. These are wicked problems. And this is an age that is quite different to the way it was before, because instant news, there are cameras everywhere, there's internet everywhere, you can get answers from Alexa and Google and Bixby and all this stuff, but it's still up to you to make a decision to move on and to focus on one thing. And so for me, leadership is really about, where is your focus to a better world? Where is the focus for a common good? What are you going to do that will pursue and prosecute that end of a better world, right? Because at the moment, what I'm seeing is not really going to be much of a better world right now. But in my own little world, I'm doing my best. And I think if 100 million other people did their very best towards a better world, like picking up the rubbish in the street once a weekend, looking like a lunatic in your big hat, or going off and volunteering at a kid's playground to teach kids how to chalk up a hopscotch on the ground and play the game, or to assist a bunch of nurses in a nursing home, make beds. You just nothing stuff.
There's a saying: start where you are, do what you can. There's a famous leadership quote. In some ways, it echoes what you're saying. Yeah.
But these are just the little things that are trivial to you but mean so much out there. And if everyone did that, back in the day, I know that people would give service. They would be, like my grandmother's day, they would be on church committees, they'd be baking lamingtons, they'd be doing the democracy sausage, I guess, before that sort of became a thing. But people would always give. There was always a part of you, of your family, that would give. And back in the day, that was often women who would give free music lessons to the kids at school, or run the tuck shop, or do work on the church fates or the dead balls or whatever. And I think we've also lost that effort of volunteerism. You certainly saw it writ large in 2000, where everyone came out on the streets with a "Welcome to Australia," like it was so cool. But now that's slowly again declined, in part I think for financial pressures. People are just stuffed by the time they get home from working 2 jobs. Get it? But there's also that thing of, well, why should I? What's in it for me? There's all these people just wasting all this money. Why should I care about it? I'm not going to bother doing these things. It's someone else's job. I'll walk past that behaviour I don't like without saying anything. I'm a bystander, or just can't be bothered, don't care, want to remain ignorant, I'll vote no. We're not being active in our generosity. And human beings have always been generous to each other throughout history. Maybe not as broadly as I'd like sometimes, but we are generally speaking a gregarious crowd. We like people who are like us, and at the moment, I think we can do more to build more generosity of spirit, and I think that's real leadership. And there's a real opportunity to do that. Everywhere you look, there is something you can do to make that thing a little bit better. No longer do you have to seek out the opportunities, they're there everywhere. So it's a really rich time for that kind of viewpoint and for someone like me.